All right, hello. Today we are talking about the Industrial Revolution, Victorian design, and some design reform, and the Crystal Palace exhibition. And we're starting with this lecture, which is essentially a historical context lecture for the next couple of movements, particularly the arts and crafts movement. And so this is kind of giving us a background to what is a more formal movement and giving us a sense of, where we are in history, where we are, in terms of geography in the world, what's going on. So it's intended to give us some context. All right, so I want to start with this painting, right? This is a painting by John Perry of a London street scene, and it's a watercolor from 1835. And I like to start with this image because it's showing the beginnings of what I think is very sort of recognizable in our lives today, which is this kind of visual barrage, right? This sort of visual cacophony of all kinds of images, sort of screaming at us and text screaming at us all day, every day. That's something that we experience on our phones and, on all of the media that we look at, just things popping up. And this is kind of the beginning of that, right? The development of early kind of mass printing. So this is kind of the state of design, graphic design, as it was at the time. It shows you kind of different examples of these posters. But I wouldn't even really call it graphic design, quote unquote, as we think of it today. It's really just more the state of printing, because at the time, there isn't really someone who is designing the posters so much as the printer is like putting them together from a pretty kind of limited stock of options. So let's talk a little bit about how printing works in this period. So this early on, most of these posters that you see being kind of plastered on this wall are made through what we would probably just call simply typesetting or letterpress, right? That they are created through a system that was developed a long, long time ago. This is a system created by Gutenberg. This is the Gutenberg printing press, and it's invented, all the way back in like 1450-ish. And so, a good 400 years later, they're still using more or less the same idea of how to print things, multiple times. And the basic idea is that you have to create the letters, right? So you have to carve and then cast the letters into these little, excuse me, metal blocks. And then you can see on the left there that there's these little like, squares where all of the little letters are. So then you have to take letters one by one and put them into a matrix to create the text. And then you essentially create a giant stamp, right? So you ink the stamp and you press the paper onto it, and there you have it. So this is the kind of main technology that they're working with. It's an old technique, it's an old idea, and here you can see a little bit closer the little letter stamps. And of course you have to put the letters in kind of in a mirrored way, right? So because when you have a stamp, it stamps the positive. And if you looked at some of those posters, you can see that they have both what we call serif and sans serif typography. So let's talk about that just for a minute. I want us to look carefully at the T's in both of these, right? So the one on the left is called a slab serif because it's a particularly thick serif. It was an Egyptian typeface designed by Robert Thorne. And then the one on the right is what we call a sans serif, and this was the first sans serif, as far as we know, that was developed by Vincent Figgins around 1830. And so if we compare the T's, right? What does it mean to have a serif? Do you see how the T on the left has these little lines that hang down and come, and almost like feet that come out of the main horizontal and vertical lines, whereas the sans serif doesn't have those. It's just one horizontal line, one vertical line, the end. That's what we mean by serifs, is these little feet. And these are basically these letter endings that are meant to anchor the letters to the horizontal and sort of reduce the space between the letter for visual impact. And this was more common. The serif typefaces were more common in the 19th century. The sans serif, and sans simply means without serif, typefaces were much more popular in the 20th century, in the 1900s, but they were developed much earlier than that. So on the posters, there were both of these typefaces. Let's take a brief moment before we go back to the image to talk a little bit about some of the advancements that did happen in printing in the early 19th century. So all of these are still based on that fundamental idea of taking letters, individual letters, putting them together and then printing off of them. But there's different ways to go about that. You don't have to do it by hand. And we start to see, these printers getting more and more advanced and being able to push out more and more pages per per hour. That was really important. So we start with the Stanhope press around 1800. It's made of iron instead of wood, and it can put out about 200 impressions per hour. And then we start to see the first cylinder press used by the London Times, the newspaper, in 1814. And that one can create 1,100 double-sided sheets per hour, right? And basically, instead of having the letters lay flat on the flat press, it uses a sort of round, a cylinder, right? It uses a round thing that can then kind of keep printing, keep being inked, keep being printed over and over again. And then the rotary printing press, again, the type is placed on this revolving cylinder instead of a flatbed. And this one kind of, improves on that previous technology, again, used by the London Times newspaper in 1853, and it can create 20,000 impressions per hour. So you can kind of get the sense of how quickly printed materials are starting to be able to be produced through these advancements. So let's go back to our image, right? Because I think this image really highlights this sense of all of the, millions of posters that can be printed now fairly quickly. And if we look carefully, we can see that most of the posters are for, theatrical shows and events, right? They're not really advertising products so much as, temporary experiences. And so they're being plastered over again and again as the next thing comes around and that other thing is, done. We see more and more posters, and they're trying all to sort of compete for your attention in this kind of visual cacophony of just, so many different posters. And so they use, different larger typefaces, smaller typefaces. A few have some images. You could put an image into these matrices, but it was less common at the time. And they were usually an image that was quite separate from the text because they were, kind of part of this gridded system. And so we see lots of text, lots of big text, lots of little text there. And what if we look at the painting, we can, as a whole, we can also kind of get a sense of what the painter, John Perry, felt about this new phenomenon of this kind of, advertising and having these posters put up continually. And if we look at the characters in the bottom of the image, we can see that he's probably has a fairly negative attitude towards this, right? Because we can see that there's a pickpocket on the left, a little boy's sort of pickpocketing a wealthier gentleman right in front of what looks like a military officer. We have other people on the right who are sort of cooking on the street. The street is littered with paper and trash. We have this building site that is also getting some posters put up, and then just faintly in the background you can see the dome of what is probably St. Paul, a big cathedral, sort of neoclassical cathedral in London. And so we get the sense that this feels like it's not a good development, right? That he's kind of saying this is, part of what's wrong with the city. So, of course, this is a London street scene, and we're going to start our discussion of design in England. And particularly, we're going to focus, first of all, on the Victorian era. So why do we call it the Victorian era? It's named for England's Queen Victoria, who reigned for a very long time, 63 years, from 1837 to 1901. And it was the longest time anyone had ever reigned until quite recently, Queen Elizabeth II, who is still reigning, and as of 2020, she was reigning for 68 years, so she surpassed Queen Victoria. But nevertheless, it was a long reign. And so, really, for most of the 19th century, the 1800s, we call this period in England the Victorian era. So when we think about the Victorian era, we often think about it as being characterized by the development of a real sustained middle class. And this is important for a couple of things. It's part of a greater social equality that led to increased public education and literacy. We see that there is important kind of development of industrial processes that gears towards the middle class. And this is also when England is at the height of its power, right? It's fueled by the Industrial Revolution and colonialism. And I put in this little map here of the British Empire. Now it's a little bit hard to see, but essentially the parts of the map that are kind of this pinkish red color are the parts that in 1850 England was ruling at the time. So of course there's England, Canada, parts of Africa, India, Australia, parts of the Caribbean, etc. Right, and they'll by the end of the decade, by the end of the century, they'll have conquered sort of more of Africa as well. So let's talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. What is it? It begins in England in the late 1700s, and the main idea is that it's a transition from hand craftsmanship, right, from producing things by hand, to industrial factory production on a large scale, so kind of mass production. And this is made possible largely by the invention of the steam engine. I've put a little picture of it there by James Watt, and that was invented around 1765. And it's also made possible by the natural resources that are coming from these colonies. So especially in India and Africa and other areas, the natural resources from those colonies are coming to England and really helping to fuel this, capitalist industrialism. It increased, the ability of the steam engine increased coal mining and iron and steel production, and those then allowed for new modes of transportation like the railroad and steamships that also helped transport these goods, and really sort of foster this kind of world trade. So how does it impact production and design? Because this is really what we're focused on here. So the objects that used to be essentially custom made by hand are now being standardized and produced in a factory, right? So production is then broken up into smaller parts. It's essentially the early versions of assembly line production. And so what that means is that you no longer need a skilled craftsman. Like let's say you're making a chair, right? Or you want a chair. And before the Industrial Revolution, you would go to a skilled, woodworker and request that woodworker to make you a chair. And then you would get the chair. And perhaps he has a workshop and assistants, but essentially he's the one kind of designing and making the chair. And now, after the Industrial Revolution, we see that they don't really need the person who is highly skilled in woodworking. Instead, they can break up the, making of the chair into a bunch of small parts, right? So you don't need a woodworker to like attach one part to another part. Anyone can do that, can be taught to do that. And so, they break this up. And so we move away from skilled labor to a lot of unskilled labor, right? People who don't have specialized training and who are just kind of taught to do this one action over and over again, or to help sort of run machines that are doing so. And what that means for design is that the designer and the producer are no longer the same person, right? It's not the woodworker, the master craftsman who is designing and producing the chair altogether. We have someone designing the chair and then, the assembly line produces it. And so there's this separation from design from production. And that really constitutes when we consider like the beginning of modern design. So another thing that kind of affects is the education of people who make things, right? And people who design things. Because if you no longer function in the kind of master apprentice workshop tradition, you don't have that kind of knowledge coming down that way. And instead, we start to see state-run schools and academies of art and design that are intended to help create and train designers for mass production. So how does the Industrial Revolution impact society? Well, this is very early, very unregulated capitalism, which of course wildly exploited these unskilled workers who were most commonly women and children, and they worked very long hours in very dangerous conditions for very little pay, right? Another problem was that as farming became more mechanized as well, those people lost those jobs. And so they came to the cities where the factories were to work at the factories. So there's this mass migration from rural farm life to city factory work. And so there's this huge influx of population into cities that really don't have the infrastructure to handle it, right? They don't have housing, they don't have sanitation, they don't have anything kind of like set up to help deal with these people. And so this leads to also incredibly awful living conditions, right? Really sort of terrible tenement style living. And what did this achieve? Well, it makes products more affordable for the growing middle class, but it creates really horrible working conditions and living conditions for the working class. And we start to see that the middle class, really tries to differentiate themselves from the working class, right? From those people who are there, and you have to see them. I think that another thing that's hard to imagine for us now, because we still buy things that are made in essentially sweatshops, right? But those sweatshops are halfway around the world, somewhere typically in Southeast Asia. And so we don't have to think about it, right? Whereas these people who are making the things that the middle class is buying also live in the same cities as the middle class people, right? And so you had to sort of confront it a lot more than I think, we do as a kind of generally speaking. And so the middle class, one of the ways that they reacted to that was to try to differentiate themselves from the working class, right? And one of the ways that they did that was to buy lots of stuff, stuff that they were making that was cheap, relatively cheap, but was designed to look expensive. So a good example of this is what we call veneering in terms of furniture. It basically means that, let's say you create a table, right? And you make the table out of really inexpensive wood. But you take a very thin layer of very expensive wood and you adhere that to the outside of the cheaper base wood. And the idea is, of course, to make the piece of furniture, like the table, look like it's solid mahogany, for example, instead of just like a very thin layer of mahogany over, pine or whatever, cheaper material. And so that's kind of the idea of it, right? Is to make something look more expensive than it really is. And so when we think about design during the Victorian era, it's something that is a little bit hard to talk about because really, when we think about period designs, most periods have their own style, but the Victorian era is unusual in that it doesn't have a style of its own. And really, it's characterized much more by what we call historicism, which is like they drew inspiration from the past, right? They recreated or imitated historical styles, and eclecticism, which is like not only did they look to historical styles, but then they mixed lots of different historical styles together, or sort of could pick and choose from different ones. And so instead of having a style that's like of their own time, they really looked to the past. So it's typically either neoclassical or neo-Gothic, not exclusively so, but most commonly. And those, of course, are tied to, if you think about what else is going on in the art world during this period, the neoclassical and romantic art movements are also popular during this time, right? So it's really feeding into that as well. And I brought in some pictures. The top one is a painting and the bottom one is a photograph of, Victorian interiors during this time. And if you look at them, right, the main thing that you'll probably come away with is that they seem awfully cluttered, right? Lots of clutter, lots of stuff, none of it really matching together properly, just kind of like randomness. And and that was really what was considered the problem with Victorian era design, right? That they're cluttered, they're fussy, they have objects that are not really functional or even well designed or particularly well made, but that are meant to showcase wealth and status, right? Rather than being useful in any way, and to have just a lot of them. And that was one of the ways that the emerging middle class kind of differentiated themselves from the working class. So let's look at some examples of these kind of neoclassical designs, right? So on the left, we have this Wedgwood pottery designed by Josiah Wedgwood, who, by the way, was one of the first to really mass produce pottery. In his factories, and essentially he during this period is when Pompeii is rediscovered. Pompeii and Herculaneum, the cities that had been buried during the Roman Empire by Mount Vesuvius, right, and had been kind of lost to time, were rediscovered. And so there's this kind of renewal of interest in kind of Greco-Roman antiquities. And so one of the vases that they found was called the Barberini vase or the Portland vase. And Josiah Wedgwood found a way to kind of replicate it, right? So that anyone could buy it and have it. And so that was, he kind of creates it serially. I also threw in Thomas Jefferson's dining room at Monticello in Virginia, right, which has a lot of neoclassical elements to it. You can see kind of the top border of the wall has the triglyphs and metope pattern, right, that we associate with Greco-Roman architecture, of the Doric order, and lots of other little details. And then I also threw in this fashion plate, and this is one of the earliest, essentially, fashion magazines, called Ackerman's Repository. And these were, illustrations of contemporary dresses that appeared in essentially monthly subscription magazines that had commentary on fashion trends and advice, right? So very similar to what we have today. And what she's showing off is a calico, a printed cotton fabric, clothing that became a middle class commodity that was typically imported from one of the colonies in India. And what we see, however, is that the style of the dress is what we call an empire style, right? We still even call it that high waist, we call that an empire waist dress. And so this is kind of inspired by, images that they found, in ancient Rome, right? So that they're kind of recreating that style of dress that was really popular during, the late 18 teens, early 1820s. We also see examples of neo-Gothic design, right? So on the one hand, we have this uh, chair by Thomas Chippendale, right? A furniture producer. And he actually publishes this catalog known as the Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director in 1754. And again, sort of early kind of smart ways of mass production. He publishes this to coincide with the election of Parliament. And so he's kind of catering to these new parliamentarians that are now moving to London to do their thing. And, they need new furniture, that's specifically designed for city living in apartments and townhouses. And so he makes a wide range of styles, but here you can see the Gothic chair. And the Gothic chair has this element in the back of it that looks almost like a Gothic window, right, with these sort of pointed arches and, different like tri-lobed forms. We also see wallpaper, right, in the Gothic style, having a series of kind of Gothic pinnacles that look like they're just kind of almost photographs from, uh, from different buildings, right? Kind of collaged together in a weird way. And then we have this walnut cabinet on the far right that is a little bit more sophisticated, right? But it still has, these features that are kind of overly fussily designed, like um, lots of wood inlay, lots of turned bits, and the kind of, again, the pointed arch and the lobes in the center. That this is just seen as like too much, essentially, by later people. So let's talk a little bit about those reformers, right? Because we start to see a move to reform design that comes from, on the one hand, a response to the social unrest that's created by the abuse of, the unskilled labor populations. But probably even more so, this feeling that mass-produced objects were really poorly designed and poorly made. And so they wanted to sort of fix that problem uh, to a large degree. And so one of the things that they did was develop design schools, like I said, to create standards of good design. And we'll see that later reformers also have this idea, especially when we get to the arts and crafts, that things should go back to being hand produced. But the thing is, these reformers, they don't understand that you can't, once the Industrial Revolution has left the station, so to speak, you can't get that train back, right? So their reforms were, intended to help or impact the middle and lower classes, but really they only impacted the very wealthy, right? Because when we think about it, handcrafted things are often only affordable by the very wealthy. But one of the things that they started with, like one of the first baby steps towards reform, was to try to get rid of eclecticism. That was the thing that they hated the most, was this like all the different things and all different styles that don't go together, like why? And so architects in particular started to take a greater interest in the interior design of their buildings, and they tried to create what's called a total work of art. In German, it's called a Gesamtkunstwerk. It's a sort of German concept in which the architecture and interior is designed in a single unified aesthetic, often by one person, sometimes, as a team of people, but working together, excuse me, to create this sense of a unified, singular design style. And the major figures in reform are Pugin, Cole, and Ruskin. And today we'll talk about Pugin and Cole, and we'll talk about Ruskin in a later class. So let's start with Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. He is a designer, an architect, an author, and he felt like, again, the eclecticism of Victorian design and interiors was the problem, right? It was inferior to the stylistic unity of, say, just Gothic-inspired historicism, right? So they're still kind of on board with historicism, but just like choose one is kind of their point. And he believed, there's a lot of their discourse that places a lot of moral rhetoric onto design questions, right? So he has this idea that stylistic unity, like just having one Gothic style, was a metaphor for societal unity, right? That everyone could come together as like a singular group, and that everything would be fine, is kind of the idea. And again, they believe that historicism was okay, but they also felt like it can't be directly copied, right? You can't just sort of take something and, without really understanding it or the design principles behind it, just sort of place it on something else. And so one of the things that he really felt strongly about, like many of the reformers from this period, was that surfaces like walls and floors that are necessarily two-dimensional, right? That they should only have two-dimensional designs on them, right? That highlight the surface, or that don't kind of hide the surface, rather than three-dimensional designs, or designs that are meant to look three-dimensional, I should say, that pretend like the surface isn't there, right? That have this kind of illusional three-dimensionalism. And so they preferred that kind of two-dimensional quality. And so if we look at the probably most famous thing that he designs this in collaboration with Sir Charles Barry, who's the architect, and Pugin does the interiors of the Houses of Parliament, which is the Palace of Westminster, right, in London. And you can see that they've designed this building, which houses, Parliament, and they've designed it in this kind of vaguely neo-Gothic style, right? Lots of stonework, lots of pointed arches, etc. And then the interiors, you can see, are also kind of inspired by the by the Gothic as well, in this, classic example of this sort of neo-Gothic building. But he was pretty scrupulous about how you converted things into Gothic, right? So, for example, on the right, the red one, we see this patterned wallpaper that was designed by Pugin for the Houses of Parliament. And on the left, we see the wallpaper in the Gothic style that we just talked about. And essentially, he hated the one on the left, right? He talks about it. He says, quote, "What are commonly termed Gothic pattern papers for hanging on walls, where a wretched caricature of a pointed building is repeated from skirting to cornice, door over pinnacle, and pinnacle over door," right? So he calls it wretched. And basically, his problem is twofold. One, it's just kind of replicating Gothic stuff without, making any sense. Like I said, it's a sort of weird collage of these pinnacles that are kind of on top of one another. And then, he says door over pinnacle and pinnacle over door. It doesn't make sense. And then it's secondly a problem because it's sort of almost pretending to be three-dimensional in a way, right? In a way that seems to clash with the idea of the wall as a surface. Whereas his pattern, it seems vaguely medieval, but it's not copying anything directly. It's sort of inspired by the medieval. Um, and it's creating this nice kind of flat pattern. So it's not pretending to be three-dimensional, right? You don't imagine yourself sort of walking through or into this building or into this pinnacle here, where you can kind of imagine the other one is more of a sense of a illusionistic three-dimensional space. And so this was kind of, again, the rhetoric that they in which they talk about this is something that is very again, moralistic. It's bad. It's tricking you. It's deceiving. That there's something, that kind of rhetoric around it. Another major reformer is Henry Cole. He was actually nicknamed King Cole because he was that close to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, right? So he was sort of their buddies. And he was really involved in starting, advocating for design education and these kind of government-sponsored schools. He also developed the periodical, the Art Journal, which was, basically a publication that was all about showing good design for designers and manufacturers. And he even established one of the first design museums. It was called the South Kensington Museum. It's now called the Victoria and Albert Museum. And again, this is another example of where they have this idea that they want to help the working classes through this. And so one of the unusual things about the South Kensington Museum was that it was one of the early museums to use gas lighting. Which meant that, you didn't require sunlight to be able to see the things inside. And so people could come in and view the collections until like 10 p.m. And so they had this idea that, working class people could come and see this museum and, after their shift. And so, it was meant to be like a nice thing, but probably a little bit short-sighted or blinded by kind of privilege here. Nevertheless, okay. So he also, by the way, creates the first Christmas card, and the idea of sending people Christmas cards. So to the bane of everyone's existence around Christmas, he, that's the one there on the bottom left. And probably most importantly of all of these things, he organizes the Crystal Palace World's Fair. So, the Crystal Palace is the nickname, largely because of the building, which was made of glass. We'll talk about that in a second. But it was really known as the Exhibition of Art and Industry of All Nations, also known as the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London's Hyde Park. And so basically, this is one of the first World's Fairs. And a World's Fair is fundamentally a huge exhibition. It was typically hosted by one nation, and it invites the other nations, so England is inviting lots of different nations to showcase their advances in industrial production, in technological progress, and in the decorative arts. And the idea is that you kind of compete almost like the industrial nations competed with each other, almost like the Olympics of technology, right? You would sort of send your best technology and your best sort of decorative arts and stuff to kind of showcase how great your nation was. And it was set up a little bit like Disney Epcot, right? Where each nation had its own kind of area that you could go to. But they also then had like the technology sections as well. It was housed in this temporary structure that was designed by Joseph Paxton, and that's this huge building that covered 18 acres of land in Hyde Park in London, which trying to give you a sense of like, okay, what does 18 acres mean? 18 acres is approximately 14 football fields, right? So this building covered 14 football fields, which is a lot, yeah? And it was itself a technological marvel. Joseph Paxton was a horticulturalist, essentially a greenhouse designer. And this is kind of like a giant greenhouse, and it is made of iron and glass. And each of the parts of the building are essentially identical, right? You can see it's made up of these sort of identical pieces of glass and the iron that's holding it together. And so those could be prefabricated off-site and then shipped on-site, and then they just click them together, right? Like Legos, essentially. And so this huge, massive building was constructed in a matter of like 6 months, which was sort of unheard of at the time, right? And it's meant to be a temporary building, right? So they put it up, it's there for the World's Fair, and then they take it down, and they actually sort of put it back up on the outskirts of London, and it was there until 1936 when it was destroyed by fire. So it lasted quite a long time for a temporary building. If we look at the interior, right, we can see that one of the revelatory things was that they didn't then cover the iron and glass with, marble or things to make it look fancy. They just left the iron bare. You can see the girders like in these different images. And that was seen as sort of revolutionary, right? That it was so like bare and it showed sort of how it was built. You can see that there's this main kind of atrium, right, that has these kind of floors on either side that have the different pavilions. And that basic layout probably is familiar to you because it's basically the layout of all shopping malls, right, that we go to now. It's very common layout. And so it, in fact, inspired the very first department store, which was the Bon Marché in Paris that was built in 1869. And so we can see the different nations, their banners. We see that it's this huge building that has trees inside of it. We can see Queen Victoria's visit at the bottom. That was a big event. And so it's all designed to show off Victorian Britain's industrial ingenuity and progress. And the building itself, of course, is an example of that. Here you can see some of the machines that were on display and people kind of going to see the different machines. Part of that was like the attraction, right? To be able to see how these newfangled machines worked and to see them running. And it was meant to be sort of exciting and exotic. And even now, like if you go, for example, to the Baltimore Museum of Industry down by the harbor, you can see kind of like 19th century machines in action, and it's very sort of visually appealing, right, to watch all of these things turn and the bands run and everything. Like it's an exciting thing to see even today. I want to end with this image, which is the front cover of the illustrated catalog for the Great Exhibition, for the Crystal Palace exhibition, that was published in Henry Cole's Art Journal. And so we see the whole cover there, but I want us to focus on the scene with this woman and these two men, right? So there's this woman standing over these two men, and she, is holding an olive branch, and she has a dove, and she has a laurel wreath. And so essentially she's a kind of symbol of sort of peace and and kind of prosperity, I guess, or victory in a way. And she's standing over these two kneeling men. And one of them is meant to be a designer, and the other one is meant to be a hand craftsman, right? And so, which is which? Essentially, the one on the left is the designer. We can see that he is holding a picture of the cup that the guy on the right actually has the actual cup of, right? We see that they're shaking hands, they're sort of holding hands, and the guy on the left is further identified as more of like the artist, as the sort of visionary, by having nice like flowing long hair and flowing sleeves, and behind him and around him we see lots of books and easels and a painter's palette and all of that stuff. Whereas the guy on the right is a little bit more, you know, uh, like carefully dressed, right? So, as someone who's producing something, he's wearing a smock, for example. His hair is shorter, his sleeves are rolled up. He has an anvil and some other kind of tools beside him, right? And so uh, we see this kind of idea that this exhibition is highlighting the designer and the producer, sort of like working together in this way. But of course, we know that that's false, right? That most of the things that were displayed in this exhibition were factory produced, right? And so there isn't this kind of close union between an artist and a craftsman. There isn't this kind of symbiotic relationship, right? Instead, we have a designer who's doing his thing, and then a lot of factory workers kind of like putting it together, with the help of machines. And so I think it's interesting that they're creating this almost like fictional idea of, how things are made, at the same time that the whole point of the exhibition is to highlight technological progress. And I think that shows us that tension between, around this moment, around this idea of design and production. All right, that's it for today.